Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and if you need to practice your landings, today we're going to look at a bunch of different ways to do just that in Flight Sim 2024, whether it's with a single engine piston, an airliner, or anything else for that matter. This is going to come in super handy when you're learning your next plane, since you can get those landing reps in a lot quicker to get a better feel for it, rather than having to fly a full flight every time. Free flight is what we're going to use for all of these techniques because we can manipulate the Sim's environment to make things easier for us, but depending on the plane you're flying, some ways do work better than others. The most common way to practice your landings doesn't require you to do anything fancy, and it actually mirrors real life. It can be as simple as flying a traffic pattern around the airport over and over again. The quickest way to get going with this is to choose an airport, and it can be any airport really, and when you set it as your departure point, leave it on the runway that it automatically assigns to you. That'll put you on the recommended runway for takeoff based on the winds, and once you start the flight, for most planes, even add-ons, it'll spawn you on the runway with the engines already running. It'll often be in the takeoff configuration already for you as well, but I always do a quick double check of that before taking off, especially for the trim and the flaps, since they have the biggest impact. If you're not familiar with how to fly a traffic pattern, very briefly, what we're looking to do is fly what amounts to a rectangular shape around the runway. Ideally, you'll want to keep your pattern about 1.5 to 2 miles offset, and you'll want to fly most of it at 1,000 feet above field elevation. Most runways have left-hand traffic patterns, meaning that you make all left turns as you go around the circuit, but there's obviously going to be exceptions to that, especially in places where there isn't enough space to make left turns. Once you've gone around the whole circuit and you start to turn back towards the runway is when you'd want to start descending, and as you do more circuits, you're going to become more and more comfortable with the plane and judging your distance and also practicing those landings that you want. The traffic pattern is also a perfectly valid way to practice with an airliner. It's really not that much more involved, but you need to have a much better base understanding of how the autopilot and the auto throttle systems work. The minimum information that I think you should be putting into the CDU for this are going to be your origin and destination, which are going to be the same airport in fact, but that'll allow you to also pick a departure and arrival runway. On the departure side, all you really need to pick is the runway you're taking off from. Nothing else is really necessary there. And on the approach side of things, you'll want to pick the runway and an ILS approach as well. Which one you pick doesn't really matter. You're just using it as a visual reference on the navigation display of where the final approach path is going to be, so it makes it that little bit easier to know where you are relative to it. With that set though, you can absolutely just take off and keep most of the automation off to fly around the circuit like you would with a smaller plane, and there's just something really fun of flying an airliner this way. I find it's easiest to leave the auto throttle on to manage your airspeed with it, but leave the autopilot off so that you're flying it yourself around the circuit, but again, it takes practice to get even that right. You'll want to do your circuit that little bit higher, probably around 2,000 to 2,500 feet above the field, and give yourself a bit more distance on every leg that you fly so that you have just that little bit more leeway if you screw something up, but you're gonna get so much better at hand flying and landing that it's gonna pay off later. There's obviously a ton more details that I could go into about flying a traffic pattern, but we've got a lot more ways that we can practice our landings that we need to look at, so if you want more details about this one, I'll have some links in the description for you. Flying a full traffic pattern, while fun and very good to get used to a new plane, still takes a fair amount of time to do when all you want is to practice that last little bit of actually landing. So with that in mind, the next way that we're going to go about practicing our landings is with Slew Mode, which basically allows you to move your plane in any direction that you want while effectively being paused midair. You set this up from the world map as well. Just click on the airport that you want to practice at and set it as your departure so that it picks the active runway for you. Once that's set, you can start the flight, and again you'll end up on the runway with the engines running just like we saw earlier, but this time we're going to go into Slew Mode directly to move the plane. By default, Slew Mode is mapped to Shift Z on the keyboard and is going to switch to an external view the moment that you toggle it. There are keys mapped to move the plane in every direction with Slew Mode, but all we're going to need here to put our plane in position is S to slew it backwards and E to increase our altitude. You'll want to give yourself more of a gap than you think you need on final though, because things get a bit wonky when you come out of Slew Mode, but you sort of get used to it after doing it a few times. Once you're in the spot you think should work, you can exit Slew Mode by pressing Shift Z again, but be ready to recover it because it tends to want to pitch up and the airspeed is going to shoot right up to. That's kind of the downside of Slew Mode because you have to wait until things settle down to configure for the approach, because you could potentially damage the flaps and the gear depending on the airplane that you're flying at the speeds that it starts out at when you exit Slew Mode. That's why I think Slew Mode is okay for GA planes, since there isn't a ton to configure anyways before landing, and if you give yourself enough of a gap on final, you should have plenty of time for things to settle down. It really gives you a quick way to get yourself on final to practice your approach, so if that's all you're interested in, this is probably the way to go. For those same reasons that we just mentioned though, Slew Mode is really not ideal for airliners because there is a lot more to configure there, and we're going to look at a better way to handle those in just a bit. This next one that we're going to look at is something I'm calling the drop pin technique. If you click anywhere on the world map, it's going to add a pin that you can then set as your departure point to start from, so you can literally line yourself up on final right away. The drop-down's automatically set for you to start airborne, but as far as I can tell, you can't control the altitude that it sets there for your starting point, and it's going to use something different depending on the type of plane that you've picked. For small GA planes, it defaults to 1500 feet, which is actually perfect for what we need, but if you go with anything bigger than that, like a Vision Jet, it's going to default to 5000 feet, so you need to keep that in mind to put your pin further out. I tend to give myself anywhere between 5 and 15 miles from the runway, depending on the altitude that it's starting me out at, just so that like that I have a little bit of leeway as I spawn in to get everything ready. Similar to what we saw with Slew Mode, it starts out at a very high airspeed for some reason, and you need to give it a couple of seconds to slow down before configuring for the approach. That gives you some time to get oriented and figure out where the runway is, because it won't always align you with it. And what can also help if you're struggling to keep up with everything is to use active pause. You enable that from the handlebar menu, and although you're not moving anymore, you can still make changes to the gear, the flaps, the trim, and so on without having to worry about flying the plane. Once you've got all of that sorted out, at that point you can disable active pause and you should be in good shape to take control for the approach. One last trick: if you haven't given yourself enough distance from the runway and you start out too high, what you can do is a 360-degree turn on yourself until you reach an altitude that makes more sense, and then like that you should be able to line yourself up more easily to land. Airliners, just like we saw previously with Slew Mode, really aren't well suited to using the drop pin, because wherever you put it, it ends up setting it to start at 30,000 feet, which is not useful at all to practice our landings, but luckily that's where this next technique comes into play. The best way by far to practice with airliners is to use replay mode to record a normal approach that you're doing and then use it to rewind and take back control. There are a few different replay tools out there you can use, with my favorite being Flight Recorder, but the built-in one works just as well, and it's what we'll use here since everyone has it by default. Now you've got two ways to go about this. Either you do a quick traffic pattern loop like we looked at earlier, or the other option is to go out and fly a regular flight like you just normally would. Either way, once you turn final, you can bring up the replay tool and start recording. It's as simple as one button press, and then fly the rest of the approach as you normally would until you're on the ground. Even when you close the replay tool, the recording is still running, and it's capturing every move you make, whether it be with the primary flight controls, the flaps, the gear, and even the trim. Once you're back on the ground though, at that point, bring the replay window back up, and you're going to want to stop the recording, and then before you do absolutely anything else, make sure to hit save right here. At that point, we can start watching the replay by just pressing the play button, and the plane's position is going to quickly reset itself to where you initially hit the record button. And like I was just saying, it's going to replicate every little move that we just did flying the approach, which is the beauty of this technique, because we can take back control at any point that we want to try again. If I wanted to do just the last 500 feet or so, I could scroll the replay forward and only at that point take control. It's entirely up to you to decide. However, once you do press that take control button, you are now back in control of everything that's happening to the plane. That lets you practice over and over again very easily, and it picks up from the configuration that it was in at the moment that you stop the replay. So one thing to be careful of is that you need to reset the detents on your physical devices to the right place. If you don't, the plane's configuration might be wrong when you stop the replay because it's getting opposite input signals, one from the replay tool, which is telling it where everything should be set, and one from how your physical device is actually set, so you have to be careful about that. Of all of the ways we just talked about, this is probably my favorite and the most flexible for any airplane type, really, and it's the one that I'm pretty much using most of the time. I hope you learned something useful today, and make sure to like the video if you did, and subscribe to get more similar content to this one on your way out.